when people are shaming you and they don't care about your intentions, and they're not offering rational justification for their claims, that's a purity code. And it can dress itself up as being in service of the most noble ends, but it's a purity code. It's a form of bullshit. It's making salient and catchy certain appearances that actually do not track reality and try to dissuade us from questioning or reflecting or seeking if this particular rule is grounded in reality. That's a purity code. Welcome back to After Socrates. This is episode 9. We continued last time our long journey through the reverse engineering, and we looked at inner dialogos, the daemonion of Socrates, and the dialogical self. For those of you who are interested in exploring the topic of the self more, I point you towards the series I did with Greg Enriquez and Christopher Mastropietro on my YouTube channel called The Elusive Eye. There we, using the collective intelligence of distributed cognition within an integration of argumentation and dialogos, trying to exemplify something and experiment with something, we made a collective argument for the self as a dynamical, dialogical self, but nevertheless real. So for those of you who want to really go even more deeply into that topic, that resource is available for you. We learned also how to add on an extra dimension of wisdom cultivation by extending the vertical dimension of dialectic. And we'll, of course, keep that in mind. Now we are passing temporally, not temporarily, we're passing temporally beyond Socrates. We're now looking at the people that came after Socrates' death. And of course, one of the primary people is Plato, but as I said from the very beginning, I wasn't going to try and separate Socrates and Plato very much. I just want to make a couple points, 2 final points about Plato before we move on to the other great disciple of Socrates. So a couple things about Plato, and for those of you who watched episodes 4 and 5 of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, this will be familiar. But Plato had a dialogical model of the self. I alluded to that a couple times when we were talking about the dialogical self. Famously, he has a tripartite model of the psyche where there are different centers. Now, he represents them as sort of semi-autonomous beings. I think thinking of them more as eye positions, very much like from the head, the heart, and the hara. And he talks about achieving an inner justice, having them dialogue with each other so they are properly proportioned, ratio, so that we are properly religio to the world. And when we get that proper proportioning, we mitigate and ameliorate the way in which our salience landscaping, to use my language, gets distorted. And when that drops, we see more deeply into reality. And of course, that affords us to internalize what reality is more like so we can conform more to reality in our inner justice. And then the whole thing spirals in a vicious, not a vicious, in a virtuous cycle, anagoge, the ascent out of the cave. And the point about that, of course, is that that anagogic process, which is the core, I would propose, of Platonic spirituality, is something that satisfies 2 of our core meta desires. Meta desire is something we want, anything that satisfies our desire to possess, any of our specific desires to possess. One of our meta desires is we want inner peace. We don't want to satisfy our desires in a way that is causing internal conflict, anxiety, etc. We also don't want to have our desires satisfied by what is not real. And the anagogic process not only leads to this opening up of the world and the opening up ourselves and the coordinating of ourselves with and conforming to reality, it mutually satisfies in an accelerating manner those two profound meta drives. And this is why I can make a strong case for bringing about a life of meaning and happiness. Now, one thing that comes up in the scholarship around dialectic is Plato has, especially in some of the dialogues like the Sophist and the Statesman, he seems to point to a specific practice. Again, it's not clear if this is to be equated with dialectic. I agree with many of the scholars that it's not, but it seems to be a component. And again, it's not, he doesn't give clear instructions on how to do it, so it fits into the broader argument. But it seems to involve what he calls practices of collecting and dividing as we try to determine what things are. What naturally comes to mind to us is the formation of a taxonomy. You know, we have dogs, and then we have cats, and then we have dogs and cats are both mammals, and mammals are living things. They're animal, not plants. And it doesn't look like that's what Plato was primarily on about, although Aristotle, to some degree, seems to take that up. And of course, let's be grateful that Aristotle did that, because that helps drive the project of scientific taxonomy, which is a very important project. I've made use of it repeatedly. Aristotle's ideas about how you construct it, a scientific taxonomy, went into, for example, the 4 kinds of knowing. So we'll see later that Plotinus, an important follower of Plato and considered the founder of Neoplatonism, rejects that sort of taxonomic understanding of the process of collection and division. So it's clear, at least Plotinus argues so, and I agree with him, that what Plato's talking about is taking place at a more primordial level. It's taking place, as Plotinus will argue, at the level of the forms. It's therefore, I think, much more plausibly associated with what's going on when we're doing this kind of relevance realization, where we're trying to make profound sense and articulate meaning. And what you can see actually going on there are these processes of differentiation and integration. So let me give you a visual phenomenological analogy. One of the things I'm trying to do is integrate various aspects of my environment, and so they form a coherent whole, a gestalt. But I don't want a gestalt, like when I take off my glasses and with everything is blurred together. What I want to do is I want to keep things differentiated with enough acuity that I can distinguish. And so what this is we're toggling between when seeing things as belonging together, and in that sense the same is more relevant to us, and where differentiating between things becomes more relevant to us. Another way people talk about this is we're moving between trying to generalize and use broader categories and discriminate and use narrower categories. And what you should probably note, first of all, realize is that of course is again this evolutionary process of recursive relevance realization. It has to go towards this optimal gripping and getting our meta-optimal grip and our meta-orientation. And what it's doing is trying to always get that balance between the trade-off of when do I need to distinguish between things and when can I group them together into a gestalt. And of course there is no answer to that. It depends on the problem, the task at hand, the situation. Now, one of the things we can note is when that systems are, like our cognitive system, is simultaneously integrating and differentiating. And you can look at the work of Kelso and others about this on multi-stability in the brain. When you're getting that constant, when you're getting a system that's simultaneously doing that, think about when you're reading a word, you're distinguishing the letters, but you're grouping them into the word. And we've talked about how it's simultaneously bottom up and top down. So when you're doing that simultaneity of integration and differentiation, a system is becoming more complex. It is complexifying. Now, the thing about complexification is it produces emergence, and this is an important property that's different from what we get in sort of a taxonomic understanding. So, biological example, you start out as a zygote, your cells start to differentiate into different kinds of cells. but they also start to organize, literally self-organize into lungs and hearts, lungs and a heart and brain. So the system is simultaneously differentiating and integrating so that you develop a body that has emergent properties that can do things a zygote can't do. And of course, there's a deep connection, therefore, between that notion of collection and division as the driving of the complexification of our relevance realization so that we are properly ratio religio to the complexity of the world, so that we continually are generating emergent abilities to deal with deeper realities. That, of course, lines up with that discussion of anagoge that we previously had. So we need to think about that. I think rather than sort of the temptation to drop into an Aristotelian or scientific taxonomy is what we should be doing, we need to think more about that process of driving the complexification of our cognition so that it couples appropriately, tracks well the complexity of the world. Okay. So Socrates has two great disciples, one you know of, because we've talked about him throughout, and we were just talking about him, and that's Plato. But he has another great one that you don't hear about very much. And that's because we don't have as much from him. We have mostly fragments. But he was known as Antisthenes. And if you want more on Antisthenes and the Cynics and the Stoics, which I'm going to be talking about, please see episode 14 of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. So Antisthenes is actually alive at the time of Socrates. In fact, he's older than Plato, and he seems to be personally closer to Socrates than Plato was. Now, when he was asked what he learned from Socrates, he didn't do what Plato did. He said, I learned from Socrates how to converse with myself. And it's like, wow, I talk to myself all day long. Well, we've done enough about inner speech and inner dialectic into dialogos to treat what he says with more respect and reflection. He's not talking about our everyday ruminative inner speech that often drives and is driven by anxiety or distraction or self-deception. He's talking about integrating Socrates into our inner speech so that we get an inner dialectic into dialogos that is oriented towards the cultivation of wisdom. So he's very much in line with what we were talking about in episode 9. Now, Antisthenes was actually quite critical of Plato, and this is good for us, because now we have opponent processing between Plato and Antisthenes that we can use to triangulate backwards and get a deeper understanding of Socrates. At least that's what I'm proposing to you. Now, the fact that he was older and personally closer to Socrates means we can't dismiss him. Now, we can't dismiss Plato and just give priority to Antisthenes because, well, just to put it in a sentence, Plato is bloody brilliant. And so we can't just dismiss him. We have to hold these two together in opponent processing and triangulate backwards to see more deeply into Socrates. Now, especially the Socrates that is a forerunner of our attempts to develop a practice of dialectic into dialogos. So I'm making a lot of use here of a book by Susan Prince, well, an article by Susan Prince called Socrates, Antisthenes, and the Cynics and the Blackwell Companion that I used previously. And it's right here. If you remember, we've already made use of this book. I strongly recommend that article by Susan Prince. It's brilliant. It's brilliant. So what is Antisthenes critical about Socrates? Well, there's a few things, but I want to zero in on those that are relevant to our project here. He was critical of Plato's use of propositional argumentation, which is really, really interesting because we have all of the scholarship saying that Plato was trying to use propositional argumentation to ultimately get people to see beyond the propositional. But Antisthenes was even more, if I can put it this way, extreme about that. Now, that doesn't mean that he was just sort of like some sort of, early Christian monk that just took a vow of silence for 30 years or thought language was evil. His relationship and his attitudes towards language are very complex and much more critical than Plato is. Plato is critical of language, he's especially critical of writing, but he seems not to have quite the stance towards it that Antisthenes does. Now, we have two of his fragments from Antisthenes, and they're both famous, but they're famous precisely for how challenging they are. So the first one is, it is impossible to contradict, which is, what? I can do it right now, right? A perfectly square circle, that's a contradiction? What does he possibly mean by that? So the point is, these hit us almost like paradoxes. They seem false on appearance, but we have enough respect for this person that we think something else is going on. So there's an element also of irony here. Very different from Socratic irony in some ways, but in another sense, very similar to it. Here's the other quote: "It is impossible to define the essence," which is like, whew, that's him making really clear that the project of trying to come up with definitions and that thinking that we can come up with final definitions of the essence, the form, what's crucial, what matters the most, he's challenging all of that idea. Now, Susan Prince argues, and I won't recapitulate all the scholastic exegetical argument, but she basically says the weight of evidence suggests these were not so much statements. He didn't just sort of state them and as things you should consider true or false. They were much more koan-like. You know what a koan is. We talked about this from the Buddhist tradition. Koan-like provocations designed to command attention and then redirect it towards something. What is it he's redirecting it towards? Well, Prince argues, and this is a direct quote, the futility of logical discourse. So Antisthenes is much more like clearly anti-definition, anti-logical discourse than Plato, which is really interesting, really interesting. But yet, he's not opposed to dialectic and to dialogos, because what did he primarily learn from Socrates? How to do that with himself. How to be Socrates to himself. Phew. Even more so we've got this rejecter of logical discourse and of logical definition, already in tension with the fact that what he most learned from Socrates was inner dialectic. But now I'll add even more tension to it. He was the first person, apparently, in the philosophical tradition, to actually offer, and of course the more irony here, a definition of logos. You don't get it? Heraclitus talks about the logos all over the place, and of course Socrates and Plato are invoking it constantly, as we've seen. But Antisthenes, the person who's opposed to definition and propositional logical argumentation, offers a definition. But as you'll see, the definition is designed like a koan, like a parable, to take us in and then explode us out. So here's the definition, and we're going to play with it, which I expect, or I suspect, was exactly what Antisthenes wanted us to do with it. He's trying to provoke us. It's like a Zen master coming up to you and saying something deeply provocative. So here it is. Logos is the enunciation revealing that what is or was. Which is like, okay. So initial reactions. in some sense, this is a response to Socrates always asking, what is it? These quintessential, Socratic questions. Well, what is courage? Well, what is friendship? What is wisdom? So the logos is whatever answers that. But notice this is such a weird way of putting it. First of all, the enunciation. It's like, why not just say the statement, right? It's this much more evocative term. So an enunciation is a pronouncement, and it's a sort of a clear pronouncement. So when we're enunciating, we are pronouncing in both senses of the word. Notice how I'm playing with this, but we need to, right? Like I'm pronouncing my words, but I also pronounce you man and wife, right? Pronouncement does that. And notice that the second one is a revealing or a disclosing or a making. And the first is an articulation, a clarification. Right? And it's somehow this pronouncement in the double senses discloses, right? It reveals. And the word here is very slippery, like revelation, especially when we use it when we have sort of mystical and religious connotations. Reveals, discloses what is, but also or not and, or was. Like, as soon as you start thinking about this, it starts to explode in your mind. Now, pronouncement is to make something out, make it noticeable. And we can even use pronounced, right, as an adjective for something physical, like, that cliff is very pronounced. It sticks out a lot, right? So what we're talking about is a clear sizing up, noticing. I point you to Mateson's book from 1976 that's shown up in some of my other talks, this notion of sizing up, right? What we're doing is we're making a distinction between background and foreground. We've talked about this with salience landscaping. We're taking the things that are foregrounding and we're configuring them together. So the background and the foreground, and then the foregrounded stuff gets configured together. And then what's configured is framed in terms of what aspects are relevant to our problems, or our goals, or our situation. And this is a way in which we are noticing what things are, how they pronounce themselves to us. So another way of taking his part of the statement is a clear sizing up, noticing that makes intelligible what something is or was. So the logos makes one notice clearly the revelation, the disclosure, the appearing, the pronouncement of what is or was. Now, why does he put on that extra disjunction? And it's not an and, it's or. So it's not and, we're not adding the two, we're shifting attention between is and was. It's an aspect shift. He's putting a special emphasis on change or flow, and the flow or change between different aspects in time. So he's probably, and we know he's probably influenced by Cratylus, and Cratylus was a disciple of Heraclitus. Heraclitus is going to become very important for the Stoics, probably for the Cynics, because the Cynics are the progenitors of the Stoics. And Antisthenes is considered the founder of both lines. So Heraclitus was this idea that everything is in flow, in flux, but not randomly. There is a logos running through the flux, very much the idea of the through line. And it is born out of a tension of opposites, like we have been talking about here. And it's not in words. Heraclitus, don't listen to my words, but listen to the logos within them or beyond them. All things are one. That's Heraclitus. That's also being now brought into this. And so the logos is therefore not a definition. That's why he creates something that looks like a definition but explodes out of any definitional framework. We have to really appreciate how the profound respect that Antisthenes garnered. He isn't saying, notice what he's doing, which is, he's like, sort of, Plato is like sort of unfolding things like this. And think about how this goes with the collection and division, by the way. And Antisthenes is, how can I bring everything in to this so that it will convey so much, so provocatively, and redirect your attention and reorient you? I want to redirect your attention and reorient you so you can track the logos as it unfolds in things. So I'm proposing to you that in his mind, logos is closer, I'm not claiming it's identical, I don't have the evidence to do that, but logos is closer to the flow of eidetic eduction that we've already talked about than it is to what we normally call a definition. We know, and this is corroborating evidence, that he explicitly rejected Plato's theory of the forms. He seems to have rejected sort of more, I guess, an Aristotelian interpretation or a logical interpretation, which, as I've argued with a host of other authors, that's probably not the fairest reading of Plato. What he seems to have rejected in the theory of the forms is precisely that it was presented as a theory, which of course it wasn't, but he didn't like the idea of the timeless, abstract, logical entities that many people took the forms to be. So whether or not that was Plato's theory, and I've argued, again, with the help of many other people, that that's probably not what's going on in Plato. It's certainly something that was being used as an interpretive framework. And Antisthenes seems to be responding to those aspects that take it away from this notion of logos that is very central to him. Now, what about this other one? It's impossible to contradict. But of course we contradict each other all the time. So that one, I have to tell you, if I hadn't have had the help from Susan Prince, I don't know what, like I had a sense of that. I have a sense of his flair for paradox and, you know, the Zen-like sort of provocation. I get that, but what's more specifically is going on here, but, right? So first of all, let's take it that this is all also meant to redirect attention and reorient us in some way. Well, what is it redirecting how is it redirecting our attention? So Prince argues, to the conception of the propositional subject itself. So instead of the proposition, Antisthenes is trying to get us back and look at the process that produces the proposition, especially the subject of the proposition. So again, how did we size something up so that it came to be something that could be a subject of a proposition? So he's trying to get us to realize the problem when people are disagreeing is not when they're disagreeing importantly, not trivially. Like, is there milk in the fridge? No, I don't mean, but when they're disagreeing philosophically, and in some ways this reminds me of the latter Wittgenstein, but I'll have to put that aside. The problem was not at the level of the propositions, but the orientation. Think of all the work we've done on orientation, even the meta-orientation, the fundamental framing, the meta-orientation, the meta-optimal grip, sizing up, the orientation from which people were speaking, the orientation and the process flowing from it, that sizing up and disclosing the propositional subject. So what he seems to be arguing is that most philosophical argument, if people actually had the same orientation and sizing up, they would realize the same things as relevant. They would draw similar and and close in proximity implications, so they wouldn't actually contradict each other. So think about this. This is actually a brilliant proposal. That we get locked into the propositions, and the propositions are opposite to each other, and what we're trying to do is manipulate the propositions, and he's saying that's only symptomatic of the fact that we are disoriented from each other, and that's the fundamental difference. And insofar as we are disoriented from each other, we are not contradicting each other, we are talking at cross purposes. Now, I'm not sure that that's always the case. I'm a scientist, and I think there's times when we actually argue about specific hypotheses and propositions. But I think he's certainly saying something we need to pay attention to when we are reflecting on the results of dialectic into dialogos and properties of how it's practiced for our reverse engineering project. Now, so what did he do? Well, we have enough of his writings, and he wrote. So he's not against writing when he criticizes Plato. So we have enough of his writings to see the strategy he adopted. And I want to read a quote to you from Prince's article, because I want to show you that what she's saying lines up with so much of what we've been doing already. Okay, when live conversation between differently minded people, think of that, let's see how that goes with what we've already been talking about, fails, as it apparently always does, at least according to him, the root of progress is education or improvement of the individual minds. Okay, that's of course very Socratic. And this takes place obliquely. You have to use language, and you have to get at the orientation, the non-propositional, obliquely, and experientially. Has to be right in the perspectival and the participatory, not through exchange of literal propositions or analysis of their logic. So what's the contrast? This is what she says. But through an expansive engagement in the conceptual fields and verbal fictions of others, examining each name and considering its various meanings, seeing the worlds of others and considering how one might change or extend one's own field, and ultimately achieving a higher standard of discourse, rather in accuracy or in range. Sounds a lot like eidetic induction and all of the dimensions we've been drawing out of dialectic into dialogos. So we can pick up on one important aspect of that. Well, one important aspect, as I say, is how it's convergent with eidetic induction, the phenomenological exploration, right? All of the stuff we've been saying about dialectic into dialogos. But another aspect that we can now give more specific emphasis is this attitude towards language, of trying to get language to show rather than tell. It's a way of drawing everything together. So the logoi, that's plural of logos, all these instances of engaging in logos and dialogos, were not arguments. Prince makes this really clear. They are askesis. This is the word we get ascetic from, but as Pierre Hadot made very clear, the original meaning isn't any kind of self-flagellation. The original meaning is experience, practice. They are askesis involving ponos, which means toil or labor. So what we're doing is we're actually engaging in practices that involve significant effort and transformation, labor on our part. That's a very different attitude than towards making arguments. It's about using language to do important work, important training, spiritual exercise. Again, very much like what we see when people using things like the Zen koan or Jesus of Nazareth offering a parable, etc. Think about all the great parable makers. Jesus of Nazareth, Siddhartha Gautama, and as we'll see later, Kierkegaard. That's a different way of using language. The Sufis have a whole tradition of stories that are parables that do that kind of laborious work in our spiritual practice with language, getting language to show us something that it can't tell us. And see how that lines up with so much of what Socrates is doing. Antisthenes is on to something about Socrates, just as much as Plato was. Now, what's interesting is, does that mean that Antisthenes would just sort of come up to people and offer Zen koans? No, like his writings, he had a different reputation. Apparently, he would engage in, and this is an ancient quote, harmonious conversations. He was doing that oblique, exploratory, educing, drawing people out, trying to play with language so it shows rather than tells. And we know that what Socrates thought of that, because in the Symposium he says, he praises Antisthenes as a matchmaker. Matchmaker? Like he's arranging marriages? No. Antisthenes knows how to bring people together or bring himself together with another person so they start to fit each other, draw each other out, are in harmony. Now what's interesting is these logoi training practices, exercises, were thought to be part of 3 types of training that were all interlocking and mutually supporting. This strengthens the case, by the way, of how we're supposed to think about how language in service of the logos was being used by Antisthenes. So there's the logoi training, but there's also gymnasia, which is like in the gymnasium, wrestling, right? And you know, this is a point that my good friend Rafe Kelly makes, that Socrates was a soldier and Plato is actually his nickname. It means broad shoulder because he's a wrestler. And the gymnasium and the academy are right beside each other and they're interwoven. And this is also the case for Antisthenes. So he sees the thing you're doing with our bodies to train them. Like when you're doing that training in the gymnasium, in one sense, you're not doing anything. You're not doing anything. So in one sense, you're using language, you're not doing anything, you're not making an argument, you're not making a case. But in another sense, you're doing something really important. You're training yourself to develop sets of skills and virtues and ways of getting an optimal grip and orienting and getting a meta optimal grip and a meta orientation. Remember the stance from fighting and sparring? And then there was a third kind of training. We have less about it, but we have some clarity about what kind of training it was. It involved a training with your self-image, your self-reference, your self-relevance. And it was designed to make you resistant to shame. Sort of the opposite of what we're doing in our culture. In our culture, we're trying to change people's behavior so that we do not offend or hurt. He was doing a practice so that people could not be shamed by anything that was said about oneself. So learning to have this resilient relationship to one's self-image, and there was practices around that. All 3 practices emphasize, and Prince makes this clear, phronesis. So the Greeks have 2 words for wisdom, Sophia and phronesis. Sophia is very much what Plato is doing, giving us this comprehensive understanding of sort of the fundamental structures of intelligibility. Phronesis is how you fit your cognition to a situation so it fits it well. So so Sophia is much more about finding principles that are context invariant. Phronesis is about being contextually sensitive and fitting yourself to the situation. It's really close, I would argue, to what we've talked about as that online relevance realization that's happening in our consciousness and our fluid cognition as we're solving our problems. That's why people call it, translated as practical wisdom, as opposed to theoretical wisdom. Remembering that theory actually comes from theoria, which means to see deeply into things. And practical doesn't mean what it's come to mean for us, which is pragmatically getting to the bottom line in late stage capitalism so that we don't disrupt the flow of money to the wealthy. What it means is, it means, and Aristotle gets this really well when he says, it's about knowing, it's not about being angry or not being angry, it's knowing when to be angry at the right time for the right reason to the right degree. That's phronesis. And you see it's about meta-optimal gripping and evolving your cognitive fittedness. So Antisthenes is doing all these trainings to really shape that capacity to enhance your recursive relevance realization. I would add one thing. This is not something he said. I would recommend, especially what we see his followers, the Cynics, taking up, and we can sort of read that back into a third kind of training. I would add training in improv. I brought a couple of books to suggest that to you. All right. Obviously, though, the books are only to get you started. And I don't do this, but I have done participant observation of people doing it. There's a video about me with two other people who are going through sort of improv movement and dialogue. It's really, really, really cool. And I've had several students who've written papers with me trying to make a case for the role of improv in the cultivation of wisdom. The two books are Truth in Comedy, The Manual of Improvisation by Charna Halpern, Del Close, and Kim Howard Johnson. And then another one is The Improv Handbook, The Ultimate, wow, I guess it's sacred, The Ultimate Guide to Improvising in Comedy, Theater, and Beyond. Tom Salinsky and Deborah Francis White. I want to talk about a specific instance of this and why it's relevant. So you all know what role-playing is, Dungeons and Dragons, etc. And then there's what's called live action role-playing, LARPing, in which you dress up and move around in physical space and you actually interact. And then there's a move beyond that, which is called Jeep form. It's become very prevalent in Scandinavian countries. What happens in Jeep form is that you go into a situation and the dungeon master isn't spinning a fantastic world. He or she is actually a director. And let's say she'll say to you, okay, you're gonna take the role, and she'll give you a specific role. And then she'll speak to the other people, you're taking this role and you're taking this role. And this is a situation you're in. And she'll pick up objects, this is a gun, this is a trophy, etc., and go. So you're doing all this aspect shifting, you're taking on identities, you're assigning identities, and then you're doing an improv with it. And the director will interrupt, cut scenes. It's so much like what's happening here as they're filming this. Cut scenes, get you to switch roles, get you to jump to another scene. Because the director is trying to get things to flow, the improv to flow, to bring about a phenomenon called bleed. And what's bleed? Bleed is when the distinction between what's happening in the game and what's happening in your life breaks down. So that you're actually not just playing a game, you're doing a serious play in both senses of the word that actually is supposed to transfer to your life and bring that capacity for improv into your real life situation. The reason I say this is because we see the later Cynics, like Diogenes, doing, right, this provocation that often involves a kind of improv. performative art. So, before we pass to a discussion of the Cynics, I want to note how much Antisthenes is emphasizing the horizontal axis of dialectic, but how he is enriching it and making it much more embodied and improvisational and creative, and bringing in a lot of the stuff we've been talking about, and really trying to emphasize it and preserve it from being ignored or crushed by propositional logic and argumentation. He's also making an important point about co-orientation, that part of what we need to do is harmonious conversation that first of all makes sure people are co-oriented before they start any exploration or reflection on a topic, on a virtue. That's really important. We don't get that in Plato's dialogues very much, if at all. So as I said, the Cynics, and this is literally the book to read on the Cynics, if you're interested in it. So the Cynics, the Cynic Movement in Antiquity and Its Legacy, edited by R. Bracht Brahman and Marie Aurélie Goulet-Cazé. So first of all, especially this is something that you might have heard if you've already watched Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, don't bring the modern meaning of cynic. The modern meaning of cynic is somebody who suspects there are always a secret agenda, a hidden motive, an ulterior goal. They're really beset by the hermeneutics of suspicion. Appearances are always deceiving and misleading, and there's always something nefarious going on behind. And whenever anything looks good, it's ultimately not good. That's not the ancient meaning of cynicism. It's so telling that that's what the word cynical has come to mean for us. Because that's not what the Cynics are that's not what they're about at all. That's not what they're on about at all. The Cynics are not in the hermeneutics of suspicion. They think we need to distinguish between appearances that mislead us and the appearances that take us into reality. And they're trying to reorient us, the hermeneutics of beauty, into being able to track the appearances that disclose reality. And those appearances have to be more real. Look, whenever I say something's an illusion, that's unreal, that's dependent on me comparing it to something that I take to be real. This is a point made by Merleau-Ponty and by Plato and D.C. Schindler in his commentary on Plato. The hermeneutics of suspicion is actually dependent, parasitic on the hermeneutics of beauty. If it was always the case that appearances distracted us and misled us, we could never know that. The very act of taking up the cynic attitude in the modern sense undermines its general claim. It's a performative contradiction. Now, performative contradictions, if you remember, are contradictions not between propositions, but between what you're saying and your perspectival participatory state. And so the kind of contradictions that the Cynics were interested in were not propositional ones, but getting people to notice these performative contradictions. And what they would do is they would do provocative, often improvised, performative art. And some of it's famous. So the most famous disciple of Antisthenes is Diogenes, and he goes into the marketplace in Athens and he's carrying a lantern around. And this has become a prototype for us. It's on the tarot, it's in a Led Zeppelin album cover, etc. And eventually people get like, what are you looking for in the marketplace? You must be looking for something that's hidden. And then Diogenes says, I'm looking for one honest man. Right? Now notice, just think about how that's an attempt to startle you and reorient you. You're in the marketplace and you're looking for all these things. And remember, Socrates walked into the marketplace and said, look at all the things I don't need. Right? And you're looking and you're looking and you're looking. But what should you really be looking for? And what are you actually relying on even though you haven't looked for? Honest people. But are they honest in the marketplace? And if they're not, then what are you doing there? Now, I'm not making a crypto-Marxist point here. I'm trying to get you to see how he works. Here's another story. Alexander the Great heard about Diogenes. Diogenes lived outside of Athens in a barrel. We'll see why in a minute. He lived like a dog. That's the original meaning, probably, of the Cynic. It means dog philosopher. Alexander came out. Here's Alexander the Great. And Alexander was a master of his own mythology, cutting the Gordian knot and riding the particular horse and doing that. And he was always cutting through and showing how he was more than a mortal man. He was a demigod. And he was just, he was a master of this. Luckily, he was able to back it up by being a military genius, etc. So here he comes up to Diogenes. He comes up to Diogenes and says, I can offer you half of the world. What do you want? What do you want? And think about looking for the honest man. Diogenes looks up to him and says, could you move a little to the left? You're blocking my sunlight. This is one of the few times where Alexander is kind of stumped. What's he doing? What's he doing with these? And there's so many of them. And some of them we would regard as sort of yucky. So I'm going to say one, and I did it in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, and you'll first, and think about it, and hold on to it. He goes in, there's two versions of it. He goes into the marketplace and has sex in front of everybody with his partner, his wife, or he comes into the marketplace and he masturbates in front of everybody. And everybody is horrified. They're horrified. Why would he do something like that? And now you're probably like, yeah, I don't like this guy. Think about it. What's he doing? He's saying, well, what I did didn't harm anybody. Gave two or one person some pleasure. Didn't alter your lives at all. And yet you're really focused on that. And you don't care about all the immorality, all the stealing and lying and bullshitting and misdirecting and exploitation that's going on in the marketplace right now. To redirect attention and reorient us. Now there's one especially important reorientation, and it's actually captured in all of those stories, but especially in the last one. The Cynics reject convention, conventionality. And they reject the shaming, honoring practices around it. So what it is that they don't like about conventions or the conventional? They regard them as man-made, human-made, artificial, not long-standing, subject to corruption and decay. And you shouldn't set your heart and identity on them, because they are unstable things that will ultimately disappoint you and frustrate you. So shame is used in order to pretend we are shamed or honored. That's used in order to pretend that these conventional codes are actually somehow truly real or the way things really are. But of course, they can't be the way things really are, and so this is a kind of fundamental bullshit. It's making something salient in a way that doesn't allow us to question question whether or not it tracks reality. So we have to make a distinction here between a purity code and a moral code. So a purity code is when we have conventions and they are violated because those conventions help us sort of stabilize social identities. Okay? So rational justification is not needed because intentions don't matter. Intentions do not matter. So while I'm standing here, something happens and my pants drop and I'm suddenly here in my underwear, right? I'm ashamed, I'm embarrassed because the conventions by which my status is preserved have been violated, and therefore I feel small in your eyes. But I didn't intend to do that. In fact, I didn't do anything at all. It merely happened to me. And there's actually no justification, there's no rational justification. Why is seeing his underwear, like where's the moral harm or the cognitive deficit? There isn't one. Now compare that to a moral code. Intention does matter. That's why we make a huge deal about it in the law. Did you intend to cause that person to die? Yes, you're guilty of murder. Did you not pay attention the way you should have? Yes, you're guilty of negligence, manslaughter. If both of those aren't the case, are you guilty of anything? No. No matter what. But there's a dead person, yes, but there was no intent, there was no negligence. Rational justification is needed whenever we try to propose a moral or a legislative law. This is why we're doing it. This is the argument for it. The cynics are trying to get us to wake up to this difference. One of the things they're trying to provoke in us. Pay very careful attention when people are shaming you and they don't care about your intentions and they're not offering rational justification for their claims. That's a purity code. And it can dress itself up as being in service of the most noble ends, but it's a purity code. It's a form of bullshit. It's making salient and catchy certain appearances that actually do not track reality and try to dissuade us from questioning or reflecting or seeking if this particular rule is grounded in reality. That's a purity code. And we know that purity codes, when we look at other people's purity codes, we can say, how ridiculous. But we, of course, are blind to how our own purity codes can overtake us. Moral codes are conducive to the cultivation of wisdom. And they were bound up in the Cynic mind with moral codes and causal laws. Those were the things that the Cynics said they followed, the moral law and the natural law. And for us, they sound like they're opposite, but for the Cynics, they go together because the point of the moral law was always to be responsive to the causal order of reality. So what we learn from the Cynics is the importance of non-propositional redirection and reorientation, metanoia, that changing of how we notice things, of how we're oriented. And that metanoia is directed to what really matters, phronesis, what really matters in this situation. Waking people up from their performative contradictions, waking them up to the difference between purity codes and moral codes, and that only moral codes are conducive to cultivating wisdom and responsive to reality. Logos is much more an exercise in transformative labor, co-trained with the other training of phronesis, the co-orientation with others, that Antisthenes taught. That co-orientation, Antisthenes, is about, right, remember the harmonious conversations, it's about ratio religio with other people. And that is more important than argument or agreement. In between argument and agreement is this other thing, the ratio religio of co-orientation, so that we can train together in becoming more Socratic, more virtuous. And remember, this all circles around back to being able to internalize this into your inner speech, internalize Socrates. So here are some points to ponder. How can we bring these enhancements of the horizontal dimension into our practice of dialogos, of dialectic into dialogos? How can we bring that in? So that is going to be part of what we're going to do, what we need in our practice. How does all of what we've been talking about back together? How can we stereoscopically look through these opponent processing and see in order to practice following the logos? So I'm not going to offer a specific practice. I'm going to offer specific practices after we talk about the group of people that followed directly from the Cynics, the Stoics. However, I want to point to you a couple of books again that I recommend you consider in order to help bring this dimension in. So, Verbal Judo, The Gentle Art of Persuasion. Verbal Aikido, the important work on non-violent communication, A Language of Life, Empathy, Collaboration, Authenticity, and Freedom, the third edition. These are all things that will help you to dialectic into dialogos. For your time, attention, and commitment. This is a very special episode in which I'm going to fulfill my promise to take you through the whole ecology of practices that you've been preparing for and the lectures have been pointing towards.